Hello, everyone. Alpha Cromwell here. This is really a follow up video to my previous video because not only were there a lot of questions asked, and there were a lot of comments, and I greatly appreciate all your comments, but this is really a follow up video to what I was discussing, but also a little bit of background on the topic today. This was the advice that this springs from the advice that I gave a young man many years ago um, when I owned when I ran an academy in Madrid, because a lot of people back in those days they were very much they saw America as a ticket to success. And me being me, I've told you many times, and I've said it on this channel multiple times, that I don't tell people what they want to hear. I tell people what they need to hear. Because as a Christian, and also as a scholar, my duty is truth. My duty is to tell the truth. And so I already know that the title of this video has already scandalized plenty of people. I know for a fact that there has to be at least one person who is outraged. What? Cromwell's gone mad. No doubt about it. He's completely off his rocker. Have you seen this, honey? Honey, he's advising people to choose a low ranked university over Harvard. Ah, didn't I tell you he was crazy? You know, if I had a dollar for everybody in my life who has referred to me as crazy, psycho, insane, I'd be a millionaire. I'd be a multimillionaire. Ironically, a lot of the people who have referred to me as crazy aren't doing so well in life. They're certainly not, they certainly do not have the freedom that I have. So I'm going to say it again, just to be clear. Knowing what I know now, if a parent or a young person asks me whether it's better to study at Harvard, even with a full scholarship and all expenses paid, or at some much lesser known or less important university close to their hometown, I would, without a second's hesitation, tell them to pick that option. And so, of course, you can imagine the young man back in those days, he was a 19-year-old young man in Madrid. He said, "Wow, really?" I said, "Stay in your country, stay in your lane." Literally, that's what I told him. I gave him the advice that any gentleman in up until the early 20th century would have told him. You're not rich, I said to him. Even if your expenses were, and by the way, in his case, the expenses were not paid for. So that's even worse. But I said, even if the expenses were offered to you, you would still have to figure out cost of living in the Boston Cambridge area. So I told him, I said, stay where you belong, stay where you're from, unless you knew that you were going to make a significant contribution to the place you were going, or if you were going to if you knew that the place you were going to was actually going to be like America used to be, the land of opportunities. We used to be that in the 19th century, for sure. That's why a lot of our ancestors, the Scotch Irish, the English, and the Germans and others, they made businesses. They created businesses here and a prosperous economy. That's the reason why. The Dutch as well. Later on, we had Southern Europeans who came, the Italians, for example, who started opening up restaurants in the 19th century and mostly early 20th century. That was a whole nother debate, though. But let me repeat what I just told you. If you have a choice between Harvard University versus keeping it low key and staying in your lane, I would choose the latter. Now, hear me out. I know you. If someone makes a claim, you have to at least hear them out. And that's what I intend to do in the video. That's what I intend to talk to you all about with all sincerity. But I think if you listen carefully to my reasoning, you will most likely agree with me if you're an honest person. Now, if you're the type of person who has fantasies and you live in cloud cuckoo land, then this you're not going to agree with me because you're one of those people who you like to be told what you want to hear, not what you need to hear. So how on earth did I reach such a shocking conclusion? It's simple. By observing how the extreme competitiveness here in the US, along with many other aspects of the entire circus that is the university process, the admissions process, has wrecked the lives of young people. And by comparing, more importantly, levels of actual academic success and knowledge among youth in different countries and national locations. By the way, I'm sorry, this is kind of off topic. I had a gentleman who wrote to me that he wanted me to get a microphone. I do listen to my viewers. I do value your feedback. And so I hope to resolve that issue in the next several days. I do apologize for the acoustics sound off. Thank you for letting me know about that. Um, this channel is your channel too. So I always make it a point to I want you to be as comfortable as possible in that regard. So any advice like that is always welcome, and I always consider. Doesn't mean it's always going to happen, but I do believe me. I do read what you have to say. And so many years ago, anyway, going back to the topic, many years ago, I spent a full day in the admissions office at Harvard University because back in those days when I did that, it was a far more open procedure. You didn't have so much security like today. So I watched how the admissions committee does its job. So I could, mainly because I've always been interested in comparisons between the US and other countries. I like to be comparative. Our founding fathers were like that too, by the way. You have to be comparative if you're going to create a worthwhile project, to see what works and doesn't work, to see what's superior and not superior, to be able to judge. A lot of people don't like the word judgment these days, but you have to be able to judge. Judgment is survival. If you're the type of person who has no judgment, you're a fool, literally. So applicants, and if you're a Harvard student and and by chance you're watching this channel, you can correct me if I'm wrong nowadays. This was many years ago, as I said, and I'm only explaining the process as it was years ago. I'm sure it's probably worse now though. But applicants were assigned a number between 1 and 4. And the number was determined by they would analyze a flood of data and coded criteria, usually standardized test scores, GPA, class rank, recommendation letters that would turn into numerical values. There was another status they like to look at, racial diversity status, which is in America, it's a religion in and of itself. There's an obsession with diversity for the sake of diversity because it looks good on paper. It doesn't really look good as much as people think, but on paper, that's what people want to have. People always say, "Is it diverse?" It's become the new religion, and this was already happening 20-25 years ago. By the way, unfortunately, it's not that new. So rather than asking if an institution is good academically, people are more obsessed with whether or not it checks a box of if there are enough X colored people on it. That's the fact. And they also wanted to know whether someone was the child of some millionaire donor. So a number one meant admit. They were admitted. Threes and fours could only get in under special conditions. One of those was being a nationally recognized athlete or the child of maybe alumni who donated loads of cash. And of course, to keep morale up, I noticed they had giant bins filled with junk food for the staff reviewing applications from all over the country. By the way, contrary to what you may think, maybe it's different now. I doubt it though. But back in those days, professors had nothing to do with the admissions process. These were not, the admissions committee was anything but professorial. It's such a stark contrast from the 19th century when we actually had real universities, when professors took a much more central role on every aspect of life on campus. Professors were even in charge of discipline. Nowadays, they have deans do that, assuming there's any discipline at all these days, because there are hardly any rules anymore. But professors used to take an active role in the life of their students. And anyway, with so many impressive students to choose from, they had to look for something more, something special. Personal qualities that could only be shown in essays or letters. We're moving in that direction again, they said, after they had removed some standardized testing. We're moving back in that direction even more. I remember one student, he had piled on dozens of activities. It was one of the most intense profiles I remember. And he was actually rejected for being, well, too intense. You never know with these admissions lotteries. And yes, I said lottery because that's what else is it? They do look at your credentials, but the process is much more than that. In reality, we should really just call it a casting call because in the US, we have the super students. And I just coined that term. It's to describe the standard ultra competitive student, the straight A's, speaks multiple languages, has done volunteer work perhaps in the most exotic corners of the planet, plays an instrument. These young people have done it all, dazzling the adults with their brilliance. It's like watching purebred horses racing around a track. It all sounds great, and these young people look like the winners of this horrid race we've turned childhood into in the United States. But the reality is far from glamorous. And I learned that from speaking with dozens of students and from reading their messages. The current American education system produces young people who are maybe smart and driven, but also anxious, timid, and lost. Their intellectual curiosity is stifled by a warped sense of purpose. They are trapped in a bubble of privilege of some kind, marching like lambs toward the same fate. They perform well enough, but they have no idea why they're doing it. So when I say elitist education, I'm talking about, of course, institutions like Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Columbia, Yale, the big names. I know I left one out, but that's an inside joke. I don't really consider them to be Ivy League, but that's just my opinion. But it's not just that, it's everything that leads up to them. You have elite private schools and wealthy public school districts. You have the booming industry of, get this, fake tutors. Now, I'm a tutor. So you would think, most of you are probably saying, wait a minute, but you have a tutoring academy. Why would you attack tutoring academy? Because the vast majority of tutoring academies in America are not actually tutoring academies. They are places that sell you a gimmick. They'll tell you, you've probably seen this before. You'll ace the SAT in 10 days. Take our 2-week prep course and you're set for life. That's not how it works. Certainly not how it works. But I'm talking about that kind of place. Um, they have prep courses, training academies, consultants. The admissions process itself, the brand name, master's programs, and the job opportunities supposedly unlocked by a degree. And of course, this is mostly affecting the upper middle class parents, mostly, let's be real, mostly white or Asian, who push their children into the jaws of this machine. So, in short, I'm condemning the entire American education system. Notice I mentioned that demographic specifically because that's the only real, that's a semi-educational system we have. Everything else is not even an educational system at all. Look at the schools that we have in the slums. Yes, I use the word slums, not ghettos. A ghetto was a place where Jews in old Europe were forced to live. No one in America is forced to live anywhere, and certainly not in a slum. Most of these problems are self created, with some external blame, of course, namely politicians who thrive on having slums and on keeping that specific clientele who live in slums so that they can continue guaranteeing certain votes. That's really what it's about. No one in America today should say that they are forced to live in a slum, because that's a lie. There are many opportunities to improve your life, not only in America but nowadays with internet anywhere in the world, really. And I say all of this as someone who has lived all of these realities up close. And like today's competitive students, I was part of the rat race. That's why I can speak with such authority. You had to choose, I remember, the most prestigious institution that would admit you. Your mind was fixed on markers like success, high income, wealth. And so the key question, why do you want to earn a degree? Why do you want to get educated, learn anything? That wasn't even considered. So I reached my conclusions thanks to not only age nowadays, but also my experience and also living in different European countries, which let me compare both admission systems in a very detailed way. And that, I always see every summer and every semester, really, I see the stress on my students' faces. And I begin thinking hard about all of this. And so now I want to show them how to escape this awful system, what it's doing to society, and how we can take it apart. That's the difference. See, on this channel, we don't only talk about the problem, we actually offer solutions. I try to offer you solutions as to how the key is in your hands, young people, to finally do away with a system that not only is it a failed system, but it's also a system that can is literally destroying the lives of so many young people. So this topic hit harder back in, I'm talking about the year 2015, by the way, the background to this video. Because in those days, I was running an academy in Madrid. It was a famous academy back in the day called Talking Point. And it was a place where students would come in and they would get academic advice. They would also get language classes, math classes, everything. I was the director of the academy. I was, by the way, it was a sea back then of mostly the people who used to run those academies were mostly British people. I was one of the few Americans. Me and there was another one called Vaughn, Vaughan, and he used to run a company there called Vaughn Systems. And we weren't rivals or anything, but we were pretty much the only two Americans running the show when it came to that. And the Spanish students, they would come to us, and they were often very they preferred. And no offense to the British people watching, because I mean no offense, but they liked our style better. We'll just say it that way. We just had a different style. And so a Spanish student wrote to me about a former friend of his who came to study at the famous Yale University in the US. And he wrote to me because he knew that I know the American university system inside and out. And I remember him saying to me in the email, he said, before my friend started at Yale, my friend used to talk about politics naturally all the time. We'd go to the park and it was so fun to listen to him and share our thoughts. But now, after 2 years there, I've noticed a change. I'm going by memory. He said, I've noticed a change in his emails. He seems more, I remember him saying he seems more insecure, worried about absurd things that I never expected from him. I noticed it even more, he then said, during that last visit. Again, I'm talking about the 2015, 2014 era, so 10 years ago. During his last visit to the US, he said he couldn't stop, that his friend couldn't stop talking about networking and how ashamed he felt for not having enough professional contacts. Can you imagine that, being ashamed because you don't have enough professional contacts? I remember him saying to me, at Yale, it seems like talking about books matters more than reading them. He seemed distant. My friend was always checking his watch. That's something we do a lot in America in the 21st century. Haven't you ever seen that? You're talking to somebody, you're having a conversation, and they either check their watch or they check their phone. They're not really having a conversation with you. And so over the years, I've taught some truly brilliant and fascinating students. These were students from good families who are a pleasure to teach. They know their stuff. I've learned from them too. But very few have shown a real passion for ideas. Almost all have simply followed the rigid, competitive track set out by their programs. Almost none, maybe you do, perhaps, if you're watching this video, but almost none of the students that I see, they don't see university or college as a place for intellectual discovery and development. In fact, for a time, back in my day, a lot of people dressed, even at the non elite schools, like they might be pulled into a job interview at any moment. Of course, that's gone because the reality is that there are no good jobs left anymore. That's the reality. Very few. So, beneath the calm exterior of some lies a toxic mess of fear, anxiety, depression, aimlessness, and isolation. And I'm not talking about isolation in the positive way, because I remember years ago people said, you know, Mr. Cromwell, you're so isolated. I said, what you call isolation is really leadership and winning your argument. I'm talking about this kind of isolation is different, though. These are the vast majority of young people today have no friends. This is a reality. You have no friends, no real friends, and you are isolated, you are lonely, and you are suffering from some kind of mental depression of some kind, either invented or not. But you're not happy people. In fact, and I say this with, I'm not making this up. A recent survey, you can look it up. Look up survey first year college students, how they showed emotional well-being at its lowest point in history, at least in the history of when surveys like that have been taken. And things have gotten so extreme that students admitted to elite, so-called elite universities today have never failed at anything. Can you imagine that? The very idea of failure terrifies them. It disorients them. The result is you have an intense aversion to risk. There's no room for error, so you avoid all chances of making mistakes. Just last summer, a girl from here in Virginia, she told me, you know, I love to spend more time thinking about what I'm studying, but I just never have time. And then when I asked if she'd ever considered not getting straight A's, she looked at me like as if though I'd insulted her mother. Of course, there are exceptions. There are some young people who resist and genuinely want a real education. We have them here at City Tutoring. But they sometimes feel like misfits, like weirdos. They have even there have even been students who dropped out of Harvard or Yale because they preferred to live in the real world, because they realized just how toxic and fake those environments were. But Mr. Cromwell, it's such a great investment. That's the phrase I hear all the time. It's usually delivered with religious certainty. When people talk about Harvard or other prestigious universities, but no one can explain what that actually means. What exactly are they investing hundreds of thousands of dollars in? Is it because you earn more money? How can you earn more money if most of you are barely employable? What's the point of that aspect of college then? Assuming you go to college because of that. You don't have to be from an Ivy League to make a lot of money. And I believe universities should exist to teach you how to think, And I don't mean the technical skills needed for a particular field. Corporations would do better at training their own employees for that. But until recently in Western history, college, university, if you prefer calling it that, was a chance to step outside the world, to be suspended between the orthodoxy of your upbringing and the demands of your profession, to observe the world from a distance, so to speak. And learning to think is just the beginning. You have to form a personality, your personality. That might sound strange. In the US, there isn't even a phrase for personality development. Other judicial systems actually codified that, the development of the personality of the individual. But it is a universal right given to you by God. Only when you learn to communicate between your mind and your experience do you become a truly individual being. Books, ideas, art, and thought all exist to help young minds around you seek answers to the world's problems in their own way. But elitist universities claim they teach students to think. I don't even know what they claim in 2025. But in reality, they should be teaching analysis and rhetoric. Those are the skills that are needed to be a well rounded human being. But nowadays, everything is justified in utilitarian, technocratic terms. And the irony of it all is that religious universities, even the lesser known ones that only serve perhaps regional areas, they often fulfill this role of developing thinking much more effectively than Harvard or Yale. And I don't say that because I'm a Christian. Far from it. I don't endorse all Christian. If I were, I would endorse all Christian universities. I don't. Not even all Christian universities are proper for this. But what I'm trying to say is that there are more of the ones who are Christian who do fulfill that mission than ones who aren't. Well, Alfred, fine. But classes at Harvard and other elite universities are rigorous, demanding. Are they really? Not necessarily, not at all. In the sciences, usually, yes. I would say nowadays more MIT or Caltech. Certainly not Harvard, for the exception of maybe one or two courses. But in other disciplines, not so much. There are exceptions, as always, but exceptions don't make the rules. And like almost everything in life, that's the case. But what I see in the US is a non aggression pact between students and professors. Students are now clients of the institution, people to be pleased instead of being challenged. And let me tell you something, I'd rather have one student at City Tutoring than have 50 students who believe that they're entitled to what they want to get. I don't treat people like customers. I am the expert here. I am the owner of the academy. I'm the one who's right. And in today's climate, that's very controversial to say. But at least you know when you come in what you get. I don't lie about it. And nowadays, professors are very well paid for their publications. So they try to dedicate as little time as possible to their classes or students. That's a fact. In fact, all the salary incentives for professors go against real teaching. And the more prestigious a university is, the stronger is this bias against teaching becomes. The result is what is known here as, we know, the phenomenon of grade inflation. Inflated grades for worthless academic work. And yes, it's true that, well, nowadays, people say young people in the US are much more entrepreneurial and creative than decades ago. I disagree with that also, but a lot of people say that. But it's even if we accept that, it's no less true that this should not change our opinions about what constitutes a good life. As things stand now, a good life, as interpreted by millions of people in America, means prestige, wealth, and having lots of material things. And the idea of being a leader is really what permeates these institutions. Being a good student means thinking exclusively about how to reach the top of a company, to be an executive, maybe a CEO, or maybe a famous lawyer who appears on TV, perhaps. Ultimately, it's about climbing the slippery wall of any hierarchy that interests you in particular. The irony again is that all these students are told that they can be whatever they want in life, but practically all of them end up choosing very few things. Since 2010, I have this other statistic or data piece for you. More than half of Harvard graduates ended up working in finance or consulting firms. You have entire fields that have disappeared. The clergy, especially Christian, but also the Jewish clergy as well. You have the armed forces are lesser now than they were. Um, Electoral politics, even academia itself, like the basic sciences. It's considered glamorous to drop out, actually, of these elite universities if you want to be the next Mark Zuckerberg, but crazy to want to be a social worker. So when Wall Street realized that universities were churning out large numbers of extremely intelligent, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, we could say that, but totally confused graduates, young people who had a lot of potential, a very strong work ethic in many cases, um, but no idea what to do with their lives, they got involved. Of course, Wall Street always will get involved. And for now, university tuition continues to rise year after year. It's actually everything has gotten worse since I first told that student in 2015, stay in your lane. You don't belong at Harvard. Admissions requirements keep getting stricter in different ways. But for now, people continue to believe in the university. They continue to believe in the lie. It seems a bit ridiculous to insist that universities like Harvard are bastions of privilege where the rich, so called, send their children to learn how to talk, walk, and think like the elite. Wasn't this already known? But we like to pretend it's not. Of course it was known. Don't we live in a meritocracy? Do we? The United States today is not a meritocracy in any sense of the word. And so to prove it, these universities have used the word diversity. Of course, that diversity represents a social revolution. Look at Princeton. Today, they didn't even admit women until 1961. The same year, by the way, that there was only one black male student enrolled. But now it's more than half, I think. You can correct me, but I think now Princeton is more than half female and half not white. Not white. And the same happens at Columbia University. Columbia University didn't admit, well, Columbia College didn't admit women until 1981. And if you walk around the campus today, not only are there more women studying, but more than half of the students are not white. Most of the non whites at Columbia, it's true though, are Asian. Let's be clear about that. There are also some Latinos, but most of them are there because they fulfill quotas. This was before the court rulings, and not seem so that Columbia doesn't seem so exclusive in their admissions offer. But a lot of these students who are low income and come from non-white backgrounds, they have a very hard time at these Ivy League schools because they can't afford. In reality, you can't afford it, and so you've substituted ambition for loyalty to what you really are, what God made you to be. But this so-called diversity, racial, gender, it's only a mask to hide the brutal economic segregation. Because let's face it, elite universities, they still live off the moral capital they earned in the 1960s when they dismantled the mechanisms of the WASP aristocracy. And those of you who are not from America, WASP refers to the old white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from long established families in the US who used to dominate those elite universities just for themselves. And they didn't go for the education, it was simply just a gentleman's club. But arguably, that's a lot smarter than what the universities have become today because they were really finished. They should be really finishing schools. And the truth is that meritocracy has never been so biased. You go to any elite campus in the US and you'll see that, yes, indeed, perhaps the children of white bankers are playing on teams with black and Latino kids. Perhaps. They think there's diversity because you come from Alabama and another student is from Pakistan or a Muslim, perhaps, of course, they never think about something more fundamentalist. All their parents are doctors and bankers. And as I said, there are exceptions to all this, but I'm speaking generally. In fact, the group that has suffered the most from this policy of so called cultural diversity are the white youths from rural and poor areas. You'll hardly see any of them on elite campuses. So let's stop fooling ourselves. This admissions game has nothing to do with the middle and lower classes seeking success in life or even the upper middle class trying to maintain power. It's about establishing the precise hierarchy of status within the upper middle class. Because in wealthy residential areas and urban zones with millionaires, you have millionaire enclaves like New York. The debate isn't even whether you went to an elite university or not, but which one. That's another debate. The debate then is Princeton versus Yale or Harvard versus Columbia. It doesn't matter that a smart person may have studied in Ohio or Florida, become a doctor, live in Indiana, have a good salary. Such a result, that would be horrible for them, even to consider it. If they could, I think some of you at this point might be close to throwing up from your discomfort. A lot of you would probably think I've lost my mind to recommend a lesser school over Harvard, but no, I'm dead serious. This system is exacerbating, it's delaying social mobility. It's maintaining a privilege for some, and it's creating an elite system isolated from the society they're supposedly meant to lead. That's why we have the America we have today. The numbers don't lie. Just to give you an idea, in 1985, 46% of first year students at the most, and I'm talking about the top universities, they came from a middle class background. By 2000, it was 55%, approximately. And then anything after 2006 and onwards, um, think of how much things have flipped. Only 15% of them come from poor, truly poor, or middle class families. The more prestigious a university is, the more unequal its student body will be. But public universities in the US don't escape this much either. Because if you look at the data since 2004, about 40% of young people studying in those universities come from families that have incomes over 100 grand a year. And that is an increase of 32% from just a few years earlier. And this has created a truly undesirable system in the US. You have wealthy families that begin cultivating this in their children from the moment they're born. Music lessons, sports equipment, personal enrichment programs that include trips to Guatemala or somewhere in Africa. Either way, as long as it's the more exotic, the better. Admission tests supposedly measure a student's academic ability, but in reality, they measure their parents' purchasing power. And today, less than half of young people with good grades and excellent credentials enroll in college if they actually come from poor families. The elite universities are not interested in them because with those poor parents, they wouldn't have the base of billionaire donors they currently have. And it's no coincidence that economic the inequality in the US is at its highest levels since the depression of the 1930s. Or we could say that social mobility is lower in the US compared to almost every other developed country today. And today it is more likely, yes, please pay attention. Today, a young person who studied at an average school in another country from a poor background has a better chance of becoming rich, quote unquote, in the future than a young person from a poor background studying at Harvard. Stay in your lane. And some young people ask me, after hearing me talk about these issues, what can I do to avoid becoming just another zombie with no idea about the real world? Well, I don't have a universal answer for everyone because every person is different. But I can encourage certain attitudes. And the best I can come up with, if a person asks me to choose between Harvard and their local college in whatever country you're in, study at your local college. Stay close to your family. You cannot understand people's problems without associating with them. And this interaction must be as equals, not in a service context or even making an effort. As a very wealthy girl told me recently, she said with complete seriousness, she said, Alfred, I sometimes invite the cleaning ladies. I'm quoting exactly what she told me. This was here in Lynchburg. I sometimes invite the cleaning ladies to a coffee. Oh, how kind. You must get out of your mind what they told you about your intelligence. You're really not better than anyone else or more intelligent just because you go to Harvard or Columbia for that matter. I don't feel in any way superior because I went to Columbia. I feel different for sure, but not necessarily superior. There are true idiots who have studied at Harvard and very well prepared, intelligent people who have studied at lesser so called colleges. You see, intelligence is something you are born with, it's not a trait that can be forged at a brand name university. You're either dumb or you're not. Harvard isn't going to make you intelligent. There are people who are very dumb at Harvard. I met many dumb people at Columbia University. And there are, of course, also many intelligent people at Harvard who, nonetheless, are not as sharp as when it comes to certain street smarts as people who never went to college might be. I know the name matters. Of course it does. I know Harvard has the prestigious name. But prestige is relative and is something you grant. I don't grant it. If more people developed this attitude of mind, all those universities that live off the game would collapse to the benefit of those who have the least, by the way. And I know the student body may be much more interesting and international, perhaps, at a school like Harvard or Columbia. Some of you might tell me our local colleges are mediocre. That may be true according to your personal values, but not for me. For me, true mediocrity is not being able to uh, true mediocrity is actually not being able to truly think about ideas, having to constantly think about which prestigious company to work for, being a broker or CEO, making lots of money, or being in constant competition. If what you seek is learning with capital letters, then I don't think Harvard is the answer. And personally, I've learned much more interesting things in my life talking to drug addicts in a bar than with anything a Princeton student has told me. That's a fact. And young people who study at much less prestigious institutions, they tend to be more curious, more interesting, more open, and much less bitter. Not being a privileged idiot is an admirable goal. It's something I decided for my life a long time ago. I'm not interested in even half the things that interest people from my so called social class. Less and less so these days. I am increasingly interested in people as a whole, in other people's problems, and in how to build a better system. So the time has come to reform the entire educational system again, to move toward a society completely different from the one that currently dominates. I used to be one of those who thought we needed to create a world in which every child had equal opportunity to get into Harvard. But in reality, what we need is a world where it is not necessary to study at the Ivy League or other private institutions in order to get a good quality education. That's why I started city tutoring. And that's why the European system, for all its faults, when it comes to university, I mean, is better in that regard. Well, at least before the Bologna Plan, because they used to have a universal public higher education system. Yes, it was funded by taxes, but at least it was accountable to the public. And that was precisely the commitment to public education after the Second World War in the US, too. It was truly the American dream. It was work and study hard, and you'll go far. Today, of course, that's a lie. It's about time we reclaim everything we've lost as a society in these terrible years of crises. We've tried aristocracy. We've tried meritocracy. We've tried diversity, so called. We've tried the Bologna process in Europe. It's time we try freedom and the defense of our rights and stop believing the lies they've told us for decades. You need to learn to fight back and take the system back for your benefit. Thank you all.